you got to have an honest conversation with yourself. Well, will I be comfortable with this aspect of marketing that I'm thinking about getting engaged with? If it does, if you're forcing a fit, don't do it. Don't do farming if it doesn't work for you. Don't do whatever it is. Like, things should not feel hard, or like you don't, I got podcasts on Tuesday. Oh no. Like, you should be excited about that stuff.
Welcome back to the Real Estate Rockstars podcast. I'm Shelby Johnson, and today's episode is for you. If you are interested in starting a podcast as a way to generate leads, build your brand, and bring together your local community. So that is exactly what Declan Spring did. So Declan is out of the Oakland, Berkeley, California area. He's been an agent for 15 years and closed over 300 transactions and 185 million in volume. Last year, he closed 23 transactions and 24 million in volume. But the unique, super fun piece of his business that we are going to dig into today is how Declan launched a local podcast during the pandemic to lead generate and bring together his local realtor community. And now he hosts 2 podcasts. He has his Let's Talk with Declan Spring, which is a popular real estate insiders podcast, along with the Bridge Association of Realtors podcast. And Declan, I'm really excited. I feel like a lot of agents are, how do I lead generate? What makes sense? And they've considered podcasting. So I'm really excited to dig into that today with you. But before we do, can we get a little bit of an overview of your real estate journey and who you are, Declan?
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot for having me on the show, Shelby. This is really great. I'm normally the one doing the interviewing on my podcast, so this is a very different experience for me to be on the other side of the mic. So I was a relative blow-in to the East Bay in San Francisco. When I did arrive here to start working in 2007, we were right on the edge of the recession, right? And I jumped into real estate full time just as everything unraveled. So, honestly, the thing that I think was smartest, the smartest thing I did was a suggestion from my broker was to get a coach. And this is 2007. It's the same year the iPhone came out. This is way ahead of social media as we know it now. Things were different in the real estate lead generation world. Fundamentally, they were, I guess, the same, but referral-based marketing was the thing I needed to get involved with. And I got involved with the Buffini coaching. Brian Buffini's from the same town as I am in Ireland. And so I kind of trusted him. You have to trust your coach, right? And I got involved with community building at the suggestion of my coach. My coach said, you don't know anybody, so why don't you get out there and get to know some people? He said, join some nonprofits, get involved in networking groups. So that's what we did back in 2007, prior to social media. And then social media came along probably about 6-7 years later in a big way. But I was already deeply into my referral-based marketing, community building kind of stuff. I think the podcast for me was definitely a natural progression of that effort to be a community builder. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So referral-based marketing is a cornerstone of my business. And then the podcast and other efforts I do, they're all related to my referral-based marketing and that, deep connections, one-to-one connections in the community.
Yeah, I love that. And those connections are so strong. And there's nothing like that legitimate relationship that you can build because, I'm wildly interested in marketing and doing a lot of research these days. And there's so much other types of marketing, like, you could pay for marketing, you could ads, you can do cold outreach, mail and calls and all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, it's like the conversion rate that you get from building a place in the community and having authentic, genuine conversations face to face where they leave feeling like you're a real human. Like that's so powerful.
Yeah, it's a slow, steady build. When you're doing referral-based marketing, it's a slow, steady build. It's almost like brick by brick, but you're building something that fundamentally has a strong foundation. So it doesn't matter what what the changes are in technology. At the end of the day, everything is built on this very solid foundation of referral-based marketing. You build a reputation. There's something else the podcast, we'll get into it, something else the podcast has done is given me a reputational accountability in the field. And, but you build referral-based marketing, as my coach said, it's a crock pot system. It's not a microwave, right? So you have to be in it for the long haul. And over time, it reveals itself as a fundamentally sound structure for business. So you get reliably consistent leads. You become the family realtor as well, which I always thought was a great idea. You know, you had the idea of the family doctor back in the day, and you want to become the family realtor, and it kind of slowly spread. So over the course of a career, you really have something solid, and you don't have to worry about the down market or the up market. It doesn't matter because you're the family realtor, right? So
totally.
I like that kind of thing.
Me too. Okay. So that's how you built your business from when you started in 2007 over the years, this crockpot system. I'd never heard that analogy before, but love it. And then the pandemic hit, I suppose. Right. Can you walk us through kind of that time and the podcast? How it got started.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we all remember it was March, I think 16, 17, somewhere around there. And I remember I was at a listing. We were doing a shoot for the listing, photo shoot for the listing. And, you know, we got a call from the brokerage saying, that's it. You know, we're locked down. We're like, well, what does that mean? You know, we were trying to figure out what it meant. And really what it meant was, you know, I know not all real estate metros are the same. We have a unique metro here in Berkeley, Oakland area. Okay. I don't know what it's like to be an agent in other parts of the country, but here it's a very tight group of several thousand agents, and it's like a hive mind. Everyone is very cooperative. You know, you see in the MLS, the agent on the other side of the transaction is a cooperating broker, cooperating agent. And we really do live by that here in the East Bay. We cooperate with one another across all different brokerages. And what happened when the pandemic came in is that routine of meeting all your colleagues out in the field, it just fell apart. And it was like, you know, you break up a hive. Everything was fractured and broken. And I just deeply missed the experience of talking to my colleagues out there. And I understood that other people probably did too. And so I wanted to sit down and not do a consumer-facing podcast, but I wanted to do an industry podcast, not just for all industry, but for my local realtor colleagues. Because I don't know about you, but like some of the national podcasts, no offense here, but they don't seem relevant to a local area, right? They're speaking to something different or bigger, but I wanted something for the local agents. So I decided I'd start talking to top producers and start getting their sense of what's going on in the pandemic. What can we do? How can we share info? You know, that idea of sitting down with a top producer and, you know, take them to lunch. That's, you know, often newer realtors to the business, you're told, go and meet people who inspire you, take them to lunch, learn what they're doing. I thought, I'm going to do that, but I'm going to share that conversation with my fellow colleagues on a podcast. So I started to work on it. And, then as we went through the pandemic, that was very successful, by the way, and I really enjoyed it. And people were listening, and we're grateful for the podcast because they wanted to hear how top producers locally were handling things. If you're a newer agent, that's vital, right? So then the years start to roll by, and I recognized that I'd begun to build something that people were really listening to. I had friends of mine, you know, calling me from Ireland saying, I know more about California real estate than, you know, probably most Californians. So people were listening. I was getting gratitude from newer agents who were learning a lot. And then I thought, well, you know, I should have this be somewhat consumer facing. Maybe I can start building in episodes where we go through, you know, what it's like to do a home inspection here in the Bay Area, not everywhere, but here. What's it like to go through a disclosure packet here, not everywhere, but here in the Bay Area. And so I started building in consumer facing episodes, which has really helped me now because, you know, I can turn to new clients and say, hey, listen, look through my library podcasts and why don't you do a little homework, step through the process. So I can build in other stuff while I continue at the same time to to have an industry podcast that's somewhat consumer facing. So I'm playing with it, but being consistent with releasing episodes is probably the key. You probably hear that a lot. It's a consistent effort. And now that I've got a reasonable following for my podcast, I'm really excited to start expanding on what I'm doing there.
Real quick, as you likely know, the 2024 Real Estate Rockstars Mastermind is sold out. But if one of your preferred vendors is looking for marketing opportunities, we are looking for sponsors. We would love to get their name and business out to 80 highly motivated real estate agents from across the country. Know someone who'd be interested? Go to realestaterockstarsnetwork.com and shoot us a quick email for more information. Thanks so much. Back to the show. Gosh, so the part where you talked about you really wanted to like niche down in your local market and hyper local, just in general, I love that concept. The riches are in the niches. And I think it's really attractive, as you're starting a podcast or as you're starting, let's just say marketing in general, the idea of more and broader, expanded, all of these things. Like hypothetically, if you're doing direct mail, let's just frickin' send everywhere. But the really powerful thing that you did that works in all marketing is niche down. Like who do I really want to talk about and make it hyper relevant to those people? Because there's some phrase about it where it's like, overall, it's just like more is not better. Right. More powerful, less is way stronger than a little bit of more. And I totally butchered whatever phrase I was going for.
I get what you're saying, though.
Yeah. So that was one thing I loved. And then the other thing that I think is so smart about podcasts in particular is what you said about talking to top producers. Because if you're an agent out there and, you really do want to talk to these top producers, how are they doing it? If you ask to meet for coffee or for lunch, they're like, oh my God, dude, I do not have time for you. Like I have so many calls and clients and all of I should be doing all these other things than talking to you. But the minute that you're like, present them an opportunity to expand their brand and their reach while having that same conversation, it just gets your foot in the door to have these really cool conversations that otherwise would never be happening.
Yeah, it's true. An interesting thing happens when you put a mic in front of somebody, they really begin to open up because I guess there's a sense of value and importance to what they're saying. You're appreciating them and they're on notice that you're after specific content, not just a conversation about what's going on in their lives. But, I learned early on when I was trained to always take out a notepad and a pen when I'm listening to a new client and start taking notes, even if I'm not really writing anything terribly useful. But that act of taking notes when somebody is talking tends to make them feel like what they're saying is important. So, they'll start to open up more when they recognize, oh my gosh, what I'm saying is valuable. And a similar thing happens when you put a mic in front of somebody. I discovered they recognize that you're seeking real value, that what they're telling you is very important. It's so important that you want to put a mic in front of them, right? So, I found that people would talk a lot more, as you said. Like people will make time if you put a mic in front of them and to express how relevant and important their conversation is.
100%. The mic and the camera. Those two things, and you can get pretty much anyone to slow down and give you 2 minutes.
Give you a few minutes, yeah.
As a listener, I think another quick note that I wanted to mention, listening to what you were saying, is that, agents listening might be like, oh, I don't have time to start a podcast where I am talking to other agents. Like it needs to be specific to attracting leads, but there is, which may be true, but there is so much power in what you even just mentioned about like when you are interviewing top producers or other people in your industry, you are gaining legitimacy within your local association. You're not only learning from these top producers, but everyone who's listening, those top producers now respect you more. You've gained more legitimacy in their eyes, and then also from peers. And so when you are, going to do that cross or submit that offer, they're like, oh, I know him. He's the podcast dude. Like that is just moves your offer up in the stack.
Yes, there's a reputational accountability that is hugely valuable in getting your name out, into the professional, field out there in your local market. Now, every market is going to be different in how it operates. As each market has its own culture, and as a realtor, if you're working a local market, you really have to understand the culture of your local market and what how does it. How is value presented? And this aspect of getting your name out there, with the podcast, it does build in this terribly important and crucial reputational accountability. You're right. People recognize me now when I'm, people know my name, and it's, every week people are like, oh my gosh, you're Declan Spring. You do that. And you're right. It can make a difference. If we have, market here in the East Bay, prior to the recession, prior to the pandemic, and now as we're, coming out of the pandemic, we're still a multiple offer market. I mean, it's been like that here for, honestly, for decades. And so, when you're in multiple offer situations, that kind of thing, agents are always seeking, well, who's the best realtor I can work with? And if they know your name and you have a reputation, that they can rely on and trust, that doesn't hurt your client's efforts either when you're submitting offers. So there are these knock-on effects.
Totally.
One of the things I really like about podcasting that I do want to talk to you about, and why I think it's a compelling and useful thing for a certain kind of agent, is that I do social media, right? I do my fair share of it, but the agents locally here that are, as what's the term these days? Crushing it, right? The agents who are crushing it on social media, the rate of production of content just fascinates me. It's like 5-6 times a day. They're just constantly hammering it. I don't have the capacity to do that. I'm 50 years old. I notice that the agents who are best on social media tend to be in their 30s, and it becomes a lifestyle, right? Every single day, constantly. With the podcast, you don't have to work every single day on it, right? Yeah. I do very long form conversations. Some of my podcasts go on for 2 hours, but they're not short, and they're released, whenever I want. I'm not tied to a weekly commitment or to every 2 weeks or 3 weeks, but people wait for the podcast to come out because they know when it drops, it might be 2 hours long. Like I don't need, one a week or 2 weeks. So it's a better pace for me than social media. So while I enjoy social media, I don't beat myself up over not, doing it all the time. I focus on the podcast, and it's just a better pace. So you got to consider what's the kind of pace you want to work at in creating content, because I do think content creation, it's hugely important, and it's got to be something that can be distributed online and accessible to people through apps and all of that stuff. But a podcast is an alternative way to bring value to the market, and it's different than social. It's just different, right? So I did want to, so people are interested.
I 100% agree.
Yeah.
Because I'm the age bracket you're talking about. I'm the 30. I just turned 33 3 days ago.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. I made it.
Happy birthday.
But I actually had a very similar thought process in my head when I was considering, like, Aaron is so kind to let me host his podcast, which if you don't follow Aaron Muchastegi, you need to go on Instagram, show him love. He's awesome. I also started my own podcast before I had the opportunity to host this one. It's The Agent Goldmine. And with that, this was exactly one of my considerations. It was like, with Instagram in particular, which was my other, media form, it's, when you think about people on Instagram, they swipe. And I know, if you're not watching this on YouTube, you're not seeing what I'm doing with my hand, but you're swiping, and the amount of time that they spend on your face is so short. And if you're not constantly pumping it out, it goes right down the news feed or right off your story to be never seen again. Whereas with podcasts or with YouTube, which is another thing I'm really interested in, it's much more evergreen, where it exists and it's SEO optimized, where if anyone is searching for the specific keyword or the title or want to learn about this, it's there. And it's so much more, like you said, so much more time with the audience, as opposed to that, 0.2 seconds before they swipe. I am so curious though of like, so you have this idea and someone's thinking like, oh, I'm sold. This sounds great. How do I do it? So like, how did you start the podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I turned to a friend of mine who, has a studio, and I asked him about, can I do a podcast out of your studio? And remember, this is like the first several months of the pandemic lockdown, right? So he wasn't inclined. He said, coming into the studio right now, I don't think it's going to fly. He said, what you need is portable podcast gear so you can show up at people's backyards, sit down with them at the outdoor furniture in their backyard, set up mics and just start chatting. He said, I think that's a better way for you to go. So I immediately knew that I didn't want to do something on screen. So to this day, my podcast is audio only. I don't have YouTube clips. I don't film it, which actually allows me to do something beautiful, which is to edit the podcast, which I really enjoy doing. So I can edit the audio, which is kind of nice. And so, I said, well, what should I use? He said, what do you got? Do you got a MacBook? I said, yeah, I got a MacBook. He said, GarageBand has everything you need. It's already on your MacBook. You can do your editing there. I'll give you a few tips. I said, great. What kind of mics should I get? He said, get these mics. I got the mics he told me to. I got a little mixing board called a PreSonus. Very, very simple gear. Plugged it all into my MacBook, and I was off to the races. I set up the mic in front of somebody, set up my mic. I got these mics that were super useful for outdoor recording because they're very directional. They only take in what's immediately in front of them. So, if there were cars or airplanes or birds, we couldn't hear them. And I started to record podcasts and began to edit them on my MacBook. The whole thing cost me no more than maybe $250, right? And to this day, that's the same equipment that I'm using. And it's great because I like to meet people in person. That's another thing that I prefer to do, right? Because it's a local podcast. I just like sitting down with people across the table and chatting with them in person. I like the energy of it, right? So I've got this great podcast gear now that, I'll ask somebody to be on the show. I can show up at their house. I open up my briefcase, take out my stuff. We're at their kitchen table. And people really like it. They feel comfortable right in their own home. And we don't have to wear headphones. We just sit there and the mics come out and people get comfortable. And so it's very, very easy to start. I was looking for, well, how do I put this thing out there to everybody? I found a website that I'm still using. It's called Buzzsprout. And Buzzsprout, is a phenomenal website that, as I said, I'm still sticking with it after 3 years, but I can upload my episodes there and the episodes then, get pushed out onto Apple, podcasts and Spotify, you name it. It's out there wherever you want to find it. That has served me really, really well. So I'm still using Buzzsprout. I think it's $8 a month or $12 a month, something like that. And you can push out hours and hours of content so that it's very, very inexpensive to start this. And it's not a huge time commitment. The one thing you need is curiosity, because you need to sit down, as you need to sit down with people and start a conversation that makes the mic disappear, makes everything disappear. A good conversation, right? As you know, a good conversation happens when people get really engaged. And that's why I like to meet people in person if I can. And then everything melts away and you're just locked in on this conversation. Curiosity. Curiosity is, I think, the elixir of life. Without curiosity, you're dead on arrival. I mean, there's no forward motion if you're not curious, right? Because curiosity pulls you forward. It pulls you into the future with openness, So I find that to be a hugely important thing. So yeah, a few $100 and curiosity and a willingness to really engage people and listen to them. That's all you need. It's very simple.
If I'm sitting there listening, I'm dying to know specifically what equipment that you have. And I was curious, is it possible for you after the show to find the links to all of the equipment that you used and put it on just a piece of paper, Word document, Sure. Send it back my way so we could upload it? Okay, so yes? Okay,
Yeah,
listeners,
sure.
if you want that list, go to realestaterockstarsnetwork.com, click on the toolbox, and we'll
Yeah.
upload it along with the show. So thank you.
It's super simple, and I know that people are starting podcasts. I hear it all the time. I don't mean to be rude to anybody out there, or I don't want this to come across poorly, but there are those realtors I remember from 10 years ago who were always like getting ready to get ready. Like they were working on their website, and it was going to be amazing. And, a few years would go by and they'd still be working on that website. And then there are agents who are getting into podcasting and they're going to great pains to set up studios and have everything look good. And I just remind people that podcast is an audio experience. It doesn't have to come with a fancy studio, fancy mics. My mics don't look real fancy and special, but they get the job done. And like anything else, and I listen to your show, and what I always hear people, content creators, say is all the time is just do it, just start. Like, don't get some ideas in your head that it has to be a certain way. Just get started. When I upload my list of equipment to you, it couldn't be more simple. It might even be outdated equipment now, but you know what? It gets the job done. And that's all that matters, right?
Totally. Okay. So we have to get started. You think of who you want. And actually, we didn't talk about that. So you have two different podcasts and they have two different target audiences. So do you have any guidance or assistance with someone who's getting started on how to pick their target audience and gear the show towards that? Yeah.
So you really have to drill down on what it is you're trying to accomplish, right? Of course, like as with all marketing, my initial intent was to really just bring the community together during pandemic, right? It was a very specific thing. I didn't really think long term about it. I just was so hungry and thirsty to get out there and hear how people were coping, especially top producers, and bring that information to my colleagues. That was my primary intent. Now, as time went on, I recognized, okay, people are listening. I hadn't really thought that far ahead, but then people were listening, and I really did like I like long form conversation. I like long conversations. Thank goodness for people like Joe Rogan, because they have allowed for people to understand the podcast offers something different. It's long conversation. I just love that kind of thing. So I was catering to my own, needs as well with this long conversation during the pandemic. Anyway, pandemic, starts to, the problems lessen, right, over time. And then I recognize, I really should start using the platform for more. So I thought, who else in the community can I talk to bring value, not just to my colleagues, but also to now clients who are starting to listen. So I began talking to local historians. I began to talk to people who were coming up for election and local politics, which I found to be a really interesting thing. I'm currently working on talking about struggle and with various coaches and people like that. So you do have to really think about who am I trying to bring value to? And for me, it's very, very much local. Now, what's interesting though, is that as the podcast audience grows and more people are listening to it, I'm getting calls from agents outside of the area and even outside of the state who now recognize me as a local realtor with a good reputation. And they're calling because why? Because referrals, right? So now I'm starting to get this additional value to the podcast that I had never thought about. And that's, again, it gets back to referral-based marketing. I'm getting phone calls from people who have referrals into the East Bay. And that's something new that I'm now, actually trying to grow into. So another part of any journey is that you do have your intent. You do have your sense of what it is you're trying to do. But as time goes on and you remain consistent, you also discover that there are aspects to what you're doing that you hadn't thought about, these add-on, this bonus. And then you have to sort of, recognize the value the new value that's coming. Does that make sense? Something like a podcast sort of, it will it becomes the roadmap, and you follow what's happening with the podcast. And if it's bringing additional value, then you have to start to recognize that and cater to that. So yeah, this new aspect I have of agents from out of state reaching out to me to be on my podcast as well. I'm grappling with that because I'm like, well, you're not a local agent. So how do I make this work? It's fascinating. And that all, feeds my curiosity perfectly, because I'm curious myself. How do I incorporate this new aspect that I'm discovering, this referral thing that's happening, state coming in from out of state? It's a wonderful project now that's brought additional value to me.
Real quick, before we get back to the episode, 2 things I wanted to share. First, thank you so much for tuning in week after week. It really means the world to all of us. Second, we feel like we're just getting started. If you enjoy what we do here, please follow us on this app, share an episode, or give us a quick review. I promise we're working hard behind the scenes to make this show as good as possible now and into the future. Thanks, guys. Back to the show.
Am I answering your question?
No, you are. Yes, I love this. And it makes a lot of sense to me. I'm going to recap though. So I think, if you're starting your own podcast, just get started, because you're going to figure it out along the way. Don't overthink the equipment, but also put a little bit of time in the beginning of understanding your intent with what outcome you are hoping for through these actions. Yeah. And then, making sure that you think through what you want. That's something that I think you did really well, is you thought about, what conversations do you want to have? What would you like to listen to? Because in a way, you are actually your target audience. Like if, you're creating something that if you were a listener that you would like. And I think that's really powerful, because it's so easy to get wrapped up in what should I do? What's most popular? What is everyone else doing? And then you might create something that doesn't feel like an authentic fit for you. And if it's not authentic and it's not fueling your curiosity and your love for, those moments, then the longevity just won't be there.
Yeah, absolutely. I learned, 15 years ago when I started real estate, I read Stephen Covey books, right? And he walked through that process of writing down a mission statement. And that's something that I began to do in all aspects of my life. I find it to be a very helpful exercise. You sit down and you write a mission statement, and that's your compass then. No matter what you're doing, if you stick to that mission statement, which is the first part of any new project, you need a good mission statement. And I did that with the podcast, and to this day, I haven't changed how, if you look up the podcast, you'll see the intent of the podcast is written right there. And it's very simple. It says conversations of substance with people I admire, mostly about real estate. And that's it. That's all I wrote as a mission statement. Conversations of substance with people I admire, mostly about real estate. And that's what I follow to this day. It's exactly what I do. Try and have conversations of substance with people I admire, and mostly about real estate. That's it. So mission statements, I find great value in those as well. Also have mission statements for my team and that kind of thing. But yeah, if you're ever looking for like, what's my angle? You have to sit down. You got to write a mission statement. As far as, that's how I practice anyway.
Yeah. If you don't know your angle, it's going to be muddy in the direction of your podcast. Like, what even is this? Question. You mentioned, your mission is to have conversations with people that you respect. I believe. I hope I didn't get that wrong.
Yeah, more or less.
So if I'm a listener, I'm like, oh, well, how are you having these conversations? Like, how are you finding guests? How are you getting them, to say yes? We tapped on a little bit of like the ego and the vanity that draws people in. But like, basically, how are you finding your lineup of guests?
Oh, it's so simple. I mean, I wish I could just podcast full time. Curiosity, right? Curiosity is the cornerstone of I think of having a pod. You have to be curious. If you're curious, then you spend all of your time looking around and you just see so many people you admire and respect. Again, it's a local podcast. So in my local community, I'm just always looking around for, there's enough tragedy and trouble out there, right? it doesn't take long to look around your community and see the good and see the people who are doing everything they can to bring value to the local community. You can find these people. Once you start looking, they're everywhere. And so I have a list of people that I just can't wait to speak to. Oftentimes they're realtors. Sometimes it's very specific. Like I will see somebody who is just doing a great job locally with their social media. They're not just great at social media marketing, nationally, but they're bringing real value locally. And I might see people who are doing great work, cleaning up the Bay, the San Francisco Bay. I want to talk to them. You want to expose and bring to light people who are doing phenomenal work locally. Oftentimes they're doing it in real estate, but not always, right? So conversations of substance with people I admire, mostly about real estate, not always, right? The local politicians, people getting in the race. I mean, there's so many people out there that I admire, people who do farming really well. Like, farming has maybe lost some of its appeal, because it's making way for social media over the last few years. But I still think farming, if that's what you like, is a very, very important aspect of marketing. And so to talk to people who do it locally here, not nationally, again, I found that the podcasts I was listening to, and I listened to quite a few of them that are, catered towards a national audience, they just don't sometimes feel relevant to the average local agent. And I think it's reasonable to have a podcast that is of value to the average local agent, right? It doesn't always have to be a podcast that's tailored to only the people who are killing it nationally. I think it's valuable to inspire and encourage the local realtors who are just coming up. We need those local realtors coming up to feel inspired and connected to the local market, And so that's what my podcast tries to do as well. I love when newer agents come to me and tell me that they learned something of great value about the local market that they weren't aware of. Despite all of the information out there, I cut right to what's important locally. That just makes me so happy, that I can encourage the younger realtors. I shouldn't say younger, but newer licensees. Yeah.
You mentioned before, I think you mentioned a team. So are you also using your podcast as a way to attract the agents who might be right for your team?
You could say that. So it was just last year that I started a team. I moved from being a solo agent, which I've been since I started, and created a small team. We call ourselves the Home Factor, and it's just me and my fiance right now. But yes, we're exploring growing the team. That's a fairly new thing, and yes, the podcast is helpful for that. Because the podcast is an introduction to local newer agents. And I do get approached by newer agents and, asked out on conversations with them and asked for tips and know-how and all of that stuff. And at the same time, I'm constantly feeling out the market for who would be the right fit for our team. Now, the team has a mission statement. I told you before, everything for me starts with a good mission statement. So yeah, as I grow out the team, I am using the podcast to feel my way through the process. And I'll be doing podcasts on team building, not just to educate the audience, but honestly, when I'm doing a podcast, it's often about, my education. I want to know. So remember, the podcast borrows from that idea that you bring people with great information out to lunch, have a conversation with them, and you learn from them. Well, the podcast is that. It's a lunch conversation with people who have great information that then I put that conversation out there into the world. So yeah, you can tell what I'm interested in by listening to the podcast, What's valuable to me in my life and my team right now is often going to, whatever the latest content is in the podcast is going to be a reflection of what's turning in my mind.
So we've talked about a lot of positive things with the podcast, of course. Mm-hmm. Now it's time for any realities, maybe less pleasant things that if someone is starting a podcast that they should at least be aware of jumping in?
Yeah. There's no downside to starting a podcast. I don't actually have a downside to it. Anything you do in an effort to further your own education and capacity for critical thinking, in my opinion, is a positive gain. Anytime you have to actively listen to somebody and practice active listening is a positive gain. Anything that reinforces good habits is a positive gain. So I don't have any downsides. I mean, it's got to be a good fit for you. Like social media and me, we're not a great fit. I'm not entirely comfortable. It's an effort, right? So there's always, if you don't like doing something, you got to listen to that. And maybe that's not the right thing for you, So you got to have an honest conversation with yourself. Will I be comfortable with this aspect of marketing that I'm thinking about getting engaged with? If you're forcing a fit, don't do it. Don't do farming if it doesn't work for you. Don't do whatever it is. Things should not feel hard or like you don't, I got podcasts on Tuesday. Oh no. You should be excited about that stuff. So there's no downside to podcasting as long as it's a good fit for your personality, right? So that's really the question. You got to make sure what you're doing is a good fit for your personality.
A quick word on our toolbox. We know it can be overwhelming thinking about all of the systems you want to build into your business, and that is why we ask guests to submit their favorite checklist, template, or tracker so you don't have to build from the ground up. Go to realestaterockstarsnetwork.com and click Toolbox for your free access. Thanks so much. For my 2 cents for the realities to answer that same question, because I know that you do audio on the Agent Gold. I'm not going to talk the Real Estate Rockstars. They have a machine behind, they've got the editor, the virtual assistants. It's like a freaking machine behind the scenes.
Of course.
Building out, my experiences from starting a podcast, which was back in May of 2023. Some of the realities that I have been overcoming is the behind the scenes editing piece, because we don't do our editing ourselves. And so finding a virtual assistant to do the editing and then overseeing, because, you have 2 choices in life. You're either doing the thing or you're managing the person who does the thing. You're never completely relinquished of responsibility. Right. And so if the intent when you're starting the podcast is to also include YouTube and clips for social media, Instagram, and the YouTube shorts and all of the things, I think for me, that has been a learning curve, and it is a continual learning curve. So and I've learned a lot, and I love checklists. And so I have checklists as well. So if listeners out there, if you want to do the video piece, let me know. I'd love to help. Or you could do what Declan does and simple the audio and crush it in your own way. Whatever is the authentic fit to you, huh?
Yeah, absolutely. Now I'm real interested to start doing YouTube as well, bringing that in. I want to incorporate that in, but I don't want it to slow down the podcasting process. So I'm taking my time with it. It's something that, I'll look into next year. I'm not trying to rush it. I don't want to have sleepless nights trying to understand, because the podcast works the way it is. But I do want to bring in video, and I'm trying to figure out that piece of it. I actually do the editing for my podcast, which I'm not sure that I recommend for people to do. I would imagine that editing might be the most difficult aspect of it for some people. You don't have to edit. If you're lucky, you might have a seamless conversation that doesn't require any edits at all. But I find that my podcast, there's stuff I want to edit out. I always tell people, look, say whatever you want, and I'll only keep what's of value and what's good. If there's anything you don't like, let's edit it out. So people know that I'm going to edit the podcast. but I like editing. So my background is, as a teenager, I was into photography, turned my bedroom into a dark room, discovered that I did enjoy photography, but the dark room was where I really found, greatest satisfaction. And just the act of sitting down and processing in a dark room, gave me just a great sense of calm. There's something about that aspect of the process that I just really enjoy. It's very quiet. It's very focused. And what I discovered with podcasting and editing, it's similar to the dark room. I sit there quietly with my headphones on and I piece together this thing. For me, that's a really enjoyable process, but it's absolutely not going to work for most people. I just happen to be peculiar like that. I enjoy it. It breathes life into the podcast, how you edit it. That stuff fascinates me. But I would imagine I'm at the stage now where I am exploring bringing in an editor, because I want to expand this thing, and I can't justify the time it takes to edit if I'm going to scale up on the podcast. So virtual assistants are probably the way to go. Although I'm exploring that right now. And that's why I listen to podcasts like yours. I'm always listening because you bring amazing value. And, the conversations I'm interested in right now are about virtual assistants, which seem to be more and more of that in the marketplace for agents at the moment. A very valuable asset to have the right virtual assistant. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm interested in right now. And that's why I listen to your show, because you always bring great content like that.
If this could help you or listeners, for our virtual assistant that we found, it was on onlinejobs.ph. And the cool thing about our editor and behind the scenes virtual assistant is that has experience with podcasts in the past. Like, she was already doing this and helped other podcasts like launch, which I know that, of course you want to take action and get out there and start doing it. But it was really comforting for us to know that we had someone on our team who had already done it and knew the ins and outs and what to do. So I think she's looking for more business. So if you are interested in her in particular, you can hit me up. I'd be happy to share the contact information. But onlinejobs.ph, you can put exactly what you are looking for, have applications come in, interview, and negotiate on price and all of those things. It was been really helpful. Things.
Yeah. No, that's very good information. I haven't looked it up, but somebody mentioned to me the other day, I think it's a website called Sphere Rocket.
Okay.
And that's how they discovered, virtual assistants were able to interview and found somebody that was a good fit. This is somebody who does a lot of social media locally, and she needed help with her social media. And she's getting that now from what she's doing. You mentioned a second podcast that I do, and I just want to bring that up because I know we're running out of time. So our local Association of Realtors, this is another aspect of podcasting that I'm really enjoying now, is it's brought me closer to my local, to the Association of Realtors, which is Bridge Association of Realtors here in the East Bay that serves the agents. And the podcast is they were looking for a podcast, but, they didn't have the resources or time. And they approached me, we chatted, and I was able to, I'm like, it's a matter of service for me, right? I think service is an important aspect of any, you want to be of service to your local community on multiple levels. So I began doing the Bridge Association of Realtors, which is now allowing me to drill down more on, real industry stuff, which may not be so compelling or interesting to consumers out there, but it's a great way where I can drill down on, real, stuff that's really more relevant to just the agent community. I can do that now through the Bridge Association of Realtors podcast. So it satisfies my curiosity for learning. And I think it brings value to the local realtors as well. Because one of the things that can get lost on people is that, in my opinion, you have to bring value to your local real estate community. At least you do in this metro. I don't know if that's true everywhere, but the reputational accountability that goes with being of value to the local realtor community, does many, many wonderful and positive things to your career.
I love that. And so, Declan, is there anything else that you think listeners should hear? Any words of wisdom? What final wrap up before we go to where people can find you?
Yeah. So, well, people can find the podcast at Let's Talk with Declan Spring, conversations of substance with people I admire, mostly about real estate. They can also look to the Bridge Association of Realtors podcast, if they want. But, Let's Talk with Declan Spring is probably the best one. And then what else can I tell you? Yeah, people listen to it and, recognize that there's great value in these kinds of efforts that extend beyond your original intent. Again, now that people are listening to my podcast, but they're not in the immediate local metro, I'm getting phone calls. I'm starting to do, that kind of thing we call matchmaking, where you're finding the right realtors locally here to pair up with, out of state agents looking in, because I might get a call from somebody looking for a commercial realtor locally. But yeah, you can anticipate good things to come. And if you have the right kind of curiosity, you'll grab for all the right things, and just it'll propel you forward again. Curiosity is important. And I would tell people to be curious about tech and look forward to changes in tech. One of the things that I noticed, again, I hope this doesn't come across poorly, but I've always noticed all my life that as agents, as they get a little older and into their careers, newer technology becomes frustrating, becomes a bore. It's like they get tired because things change so fast. Really, if you don't enjoy change and change in technology and changing tactics, then you really have to question question your career. Like if you're tired of change, that's not a good sign, right? You need to be interested in change. You need to be encouraged by change. Because I really love real estate these days in the social media and podcasts and all this stuff. I prefer it now than I did 10 years ago. To be honest, I find that it's really healthy and vital, and curiosity, and I don't know what else I can say.
Curiosity. No, that's great. All of that was really good takeaways for the audience. And I think I've loved speaking with you today. I think you're very eloquent, and I understand why your podcast does very well. So
good.
Declan,
yours too.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today. We really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah. I've really, honestly, I love what you're doing with this show. I learned so much from you. Lots of inspiration coming out of your show. And, I can't thank you enough. Real Estate Rockstars is an important show.
Totally. And big thank you to the owner of the show, Aaron Amuchastegui. If you do not know him or follow him, you should go on the gram, Aaron Amuchastegui on Instagram, shoot him a message, send him some love. And then also you can hang out with me at The Shelby Show on Instagram. Both of us would love feedback on how we can improve, what you like seeing, what you don't like so much. You know what I mean? Any guests or topics that you want us to deep dive on, we would love to hear it. And again, don't forget to go to realestaterockstarsnetwork.com for the tool with Declan with the equipment list that we're going to have for you guys. And otherwise, that is all we have for today. Thank you again, Declan, and Real Estate Rockstars. Thanks for listening.